Why would a woman, her divorce papers barely dry, her life irrevocably altered by a catastrophic accident, attend her ex-husband's lavish wedding to a much younger woman, not with tears, not with rage, but with a calm, almost unnerving smile? This was the scene at the Grand Oak Ballroom, where Eleanor Vance, elegant even in the confines of her wheelchair, watched as Arthur Morgan, the man who had shared her life for over a decade, now beamed beside his radiant new bride, Clarissa Dubois. Champagne flowed, white roses cascaded, and joy seemed to fill every corner of the opulent hall, yet, for the few guests who even noticed Eleanor, tucked away quietly, it wasn't her presence that was puzzling, but her expression. It was a serene smile, a quiet, knowing smile that seemed to suggest she understood something profound, something hidden beneath the glittering surface of the celebration. What could she possibly know that no one else in that opulent room could even guess this story? You see, isn't just about that smile, it's about the journey to it, a journey through the deepest valleys of betrayal, a testament to the quiet strength found in the face of unimaginable adversity, and, ultimately, a quiet, unexpected triumph of truth. But before we unravel the threads of that knowing smile, I want to share where this intricate tapestry of events truly began, years earlier, when life for Eleanor and Arthur felt as stable and comforting as a well-loved, familiar book, long before the pages were so cruelly torn. It's often in the brightest rooms, isn't it, where the most comfortable chairs are found and the warmest light seems to glow, that the darkest shadows can begin to form, almost imperceptibly at first, like dust motes dancing in a sunbeam, harmless until they coalesce. For Eleanor Vance and Arthur Morgan, their life together had been that brightly lit room for many years. Eleanor, a novelist whose words painted vivid landscapes of human emotion and intricate plots of deception, had achieved considerable acclaim. Her insights into the human psyche were not just a craft, but an intrinsic part of her, a lens through which she viewed the world. Arthur, a successful figure in the demanding world of finance with his firm, Morgan Financial Group, had always seemed to be her most ardent supporter, his pride in her accomplishments a visible, reassuring presence in her life. Their home, a beautifully appointed colonial in an exclusive neighborhood, was less a house and more a testament to their shared journey. Walls were adorned with art they had collected on travels to far-flung places. Shelves overflowed with books in multiple languages, many of them Eleanor's own works, standing as silent witnesses to her talent. Photographs captured moments of shared laughter, of milestone celebrations, of a partnership that looked, to all the world, unbreakable. In Arthur's study, a sanctuary of his professional life, a framed copy of Eleanor's first book cover held a place of honor beside pictures from their wedding day, a day that now, in retrospect, felt like a scene from a different life altogether. One particularly crisp autumn evening, Eleanor found herself at the Willow Creek bookstore, the air alive with the scent of old paper and new ideas. She was reading the final, chilling passage from her latest psychological thriller, Deceiver's Dance. The room was packed, the audience utterly captivated, hanging on her every word. You see, she read, her voice resonating with the quiet authority of a storyteller who truly understands her characters. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones who threaten you openly. They're the ones who make you feel safe, cocooned in trust, right up until the precise moment they choose to strike. As she closed the book, the room erupted in applause, a wave of appreciation washing over her. In the front row, Arthur's eyes met hers, and his smile was wide, filled with an admiration that seemed so genuine, so deeply felt. Later, as they drove home in their luxury sedan, the city lights blurring past, Arthur reached across and squeezed her hand. "You know what amazes me about you, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft in the intimate space of the car. "It's how you understand human nature so deeply. The way you peel back layers of deception in your books, it's like you can see right through people." Eleanor laughed, a light, airy sound. "Well, perhaps that's why you've never tried to hide anything from me. Arthur," he chuckled, a low rumble, "nothing to hide, my dear. Besides," he added, his eyes briefly meeting hers with a look of fond reassurance, "you'd figure it out eventually. You always do." Those words, spoken in affection, would one day return to haunt her, each syllable dripping with a bitter, unforeseen irony. Their life, at that point, was a carefully curated collection of successes. Eleanor's latest book contract had come with a substantial advance. Arthur's investment firm was thriving, his reputation solid. They hosted dinner parties where guests lingered late into the night, reluctant to leave the warm, intellectually stimulating atmosphere of their home. They were even beginning to talk about starting a family, a dream they gently postponed as their careers had blossomed in their late 30s. Everything, on the surface, was as it should be, a portrait of happiness, security, and shared ambition. The narrative they had written for themselves was one of enduring partnership and mutual respect. It was a beautiful story, the kind Eleanor herself might have penned, full of promise and seemingly unshakable foundations. But life, much like the intricate plots Eleanor crafted, has a way of introducing twists when they are least expected. The foundations, it would turn out, were not as solid as they appeared. The light in their gilded cage, so warm and inviting, was already beginning to cast long, unnoticed shadows, lengthening with each passing day, even as they basked in what they believed to be the unassailable sunshine of their perfect life. One can't help but wonder, looking back at such times, can we ever truly know the person sleeping beside us, the one with whom we've shared our deepest secrets and built our most cherished dreams? Or are we all, to some extent, living with beautifully crafted illusions, vulnerable to the unexpected turn of the page? The truth often lies hidden, waiting for its cue, and for Eleanor and Arthur, that cue was unfortunately and catastrophically just around the corner. The stage was set, the characters comfortable in their roles, unaware that the story was about to take a very different, much darker direction, and then, in an instant, as if a divine hand had swept across the carefully arranged chessboard of their lives, sending pieces flying, the music stopped, and the world for Eleanor Vance tilted violently on its axis. It was a rainy Tuesday, the kind where the sky weeps without conviction, leaving roads slick and visibility poor. Eleanor had been driving back from a productive meeting with her publisher at Keystone Publishing House, her mind still buzzing with discussions about her next novel, the future feeling bright and full of literary promise. Later, she would only remember fragments, the blinding glare of headlights rushing towards her. Too bright, too close. The sickening, metallic crunch as worlds collided, a dizzying spin into chaos. Then an abrupt, terrifying darkness. Silence. 3 days later, she awoke in a sterile room at Mercy General Hospital, the rhythmic, indifferent beeping of monitors her first unwelcome serenade back to consciousness. Arthur's voice, rough with what sounded like genuine worry, was repeating her name, over and over, a lifeline in the confusing fog. When the doctor, a kind woman with tired eyes, gently explained the extent of her injuries, a severe spinal cord trauma resulting in incomplete paraplegia, the medical terms were cold, clinical, but their translation was devastatingly clear. A life forever changed, a future rewritten without her consent. Arthur gripped her hand, his fingers so tight they almost hurt, his face a mask of anguish. "We'll get through this. Eleanor," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "The best specialists, the best rehabilitation, whatever it takes, I'm here." And for a while, he was. In those initial weeks, Arthur was a whirlwind of relentless support. He rearranged his demanding schedule at Morgan Financial Group, spending hours by her side during grueling physical therapy sessions. He personally interviewed home health care providers, his questions sharp, his concern palpable. He scoured medical journals and online forums, researching experimental treatments and adaptive technologies, his determination a fierce shield against the encroaching despair. At night, he often slept in the uncomfortable recliner chair beside her hospital bed, refusing to leave her side, his presence a constant, albeit weary, reassurance. Eleanor, caught in her own whirlwind of pain, fear, and the monumental task of adjusting to her new reality, clung to his strength, believing his promises were the bedrock upon which they would rebuild. But as weeks bled into months, As the stark reality of Eleanor's condition became clearer, she would likely never walk unassisted again. Her independence radically curtailed, something began to shift in Arthur. It was subtle at first, like the almost imperceptible cooling of a room when a window is left ajar on a winter's night. He started arriving at the hospital a little later each day, leaving a little earlier. Business calls, once taken in her presence, were now frequently conducted in the hallway, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. When Eleanor, her mind still sharp despite her body's betrayal, asked about work, his answers became increasingly vague, brushed off with a dismissive, "Just dealing with some complicated clients. Eleanor, nothing for you to worry about. You just focus on getting stronger." He'd pat her hand, his touch feeling more like a perfunctory gesture than the deep connection it once signified. The specialists were indeed the best, the rehabilitation efforts intensive. Eleanor, with her innate discipline and writer's resilience, threw herself into the painful, frustrating work of reclaiming what mobility she could. Yet, with every small, hard-won victory in her physical recovery, she sensed a corresponding, subtle retreat in Arthur. It was in the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers when he spoke of the future, the way his laughter seemed a little too forced, the way the silences between them stretched longer, filled with unspoken anxieties and a growing, chilling distance. The man who had promised whatever it takes seemed to be slowly, almost imperceptibly, calculating the cost and, perhaps, finding it too high. How often, one might pause to reflect, do vows made in the bright sunshine of ease and happiness begin to wither and crack under the first sustained, relentless storm of genuine hardship? For Eleanor, the storm had arrived with brutal force, and she was beginning to sense, with a novelist's keen intuition for foreshadowing, that she might have to weather its most devastating impact alone. Sometimes, the loudest betrayals, the ones that echo longest in the chambers of the heart, are whispered in the accumulating silences, in the vacant spaces where love and shared laughter used to reside. When Eleanor finally returned home from Mercy General Hospital and the subsequent rehabilitation center, it was to a house that had been meticulously, almost clinically, altered to accommodate her new physical reality. Ramps were installed, doorways widened. Her beloved writing studio moved from its sunlit perch on the second floor down to a more practical, accessible room on the first. Everything was undeniably functional, a testament to Arthur's efficiency. Yet somehow, it all felt colder, more sterile than she remembered. The warmth, the lived-in comfort that had once defined their home, seemed to have been packed away along with her ability to navigate its original layout. It was Arthur who had hired Helen Baxter, a home health aide in her late 50s with kind, observant eyes and capable, gentle hands. Helen was a blessing, assisting Eleanor with the daily exercises that were now a permanent fixture in her life, helping with bathing and dressing, navigating the countless small indignities and frustrations that came tethered to her new dependence on a wheelchair. During Helen's first week, as she helped Eleanor settle into the redesigned living room, she remarked, "Your husband went to a lot of trouble to make things comfortable for you, Mrs. Vance." Eleanor looked around at the carefully planned spaces, the gleaming new fixtures, the almost architectural precision of the modifications. "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet, a touch of wistfulness lacing her tone. "He did everything, Helen, everything except actually be here." Arthur's absences, which had begun as subtle shifts in his hospital routine, now grew longer, his explanations thinner, more transparently flimsy. There were always late nights at the office of Morgan Financial Group, sudden weekend conferences that hadn't been on the calendar, client emergencies that apparently only he could handle. Eleanor, a woman who had made her living, noticing the small details that revealed larger truths, the subtle nuances in human behavior that betrayed hidden motives, began to see the emerging pattern with painful clarity. It was the little things, at first. A receipt from an expensive downtown restaurant tucked carelessly into his coat pocket on a night he claimed to have been working late over takeout at his desk. A faint, unfamiliar, and decidedly feminine perfume clinging to his collar when he finally came home, long after she was in bed. And then, most telling of all, was the way he no longer consistently met her eyes when he talked about his day, his gaze shifting, avoiding hers, as if her direct look could somehow divine the truths he was so carefully trying to conceal. And then there was Clarissa Dubois. Clarissa, Arthur's new personal assistant, a young woman who had, as Eleanor recalled, started working for him just before her accident. Clarissa was undeniably beautiful, with a youthful energy that seemed to fill any room she entered, and an attentiveness to Arthur that, in hindsight, bordered on proprietary. Her calls to the house began to increase in frequency, her voice always honey-sweet, dripping with a cloying concern as she'd explain that Mr. Morgan had unfortunately left his phone in the office, or that he desperately needed a particular file brought to him immediately, or even, with an almost theatrical solicitude, that he had asked her to call and specifically check on how Mrs. Vance was faring. Each call felt like a small, calculated intrusion, a subtle staking of territory. Eleanor, confined mostly to her home, felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling intuition that something was profoundly amiss, that the cracks in her marriage were widening into a chasm, with Clarissa Dubois standing smiling on the other side. The stage was being set for a new act in Arthur's life, and Eleanor, with a chilling certainty, sensed she was being written out of the script. The truth, when it finally decides to make an appearance, often doesn't knock politely. It doesn't send a courteous invitation to prepare oneself. No, it tends to kick down the door with brutal force, leaving splinters and debris in its wake, the comfortable illusions shattered beyond repair. For Eleanor, this devastating arrival came one quiet afternoon, about 6 months after her accident. Arthur was supposedly at a late meeting. She had wheeled herself into his home office, a room she rarely entered anymore, simply looking for a particular reference book she remembered seeing on his shelves, something to distract her mind. She hadn't come to snoop. Her trust, though frayed, hadn't yet completely disintegrated into suspicion of that nature. But as she maneuvered her wheelchair near his large mahogany desk, she inadvertently bumped against it. The slight jostle was enough to wake his smartphone, which lay face up. The screen illuminated, and there, in a cruel, stark preview, was a text message, just a few lines, but they were enough to detonate the carefully constructed facade of her life. "Last night was perfect," it read, and then, the words that twisted like a knife in her heart, "Can't wait until she's gone. C." The initial C was almost certainly Clarissa. Eleanor sat very still, the hum of the computer the only sound in the suddenly cavernous room, the phone screen dimming back to darkness as she absorbed the full, devastating impact of those few, casually typed words. In that chilling moment, something crystallized within her, not just the cold, hard knowledge of his betrayal, but a sudden, stark clarity about who Arthur had become, or, perhaps, who he had always been beneath the veneer of devoted husband. She didn't confront him immediately. Instead, she waited, the unlocked phone a heavy weight in her lap, a tangible symbol of his broken vows. When Arthur finally returned home, humming a cheerful tune, feigning surprise at finding her in his study, she simply looked at him, her gaze steady, her voice devoid of hysteria, holding up the phone. "Who is C, Arthur?" she asked, the question simple, direct, yet loaded with the weight of years of shared history, now irrevocably tainted. His face, she observed with a writer's detached interest even in her own pain, went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, then a flicker of denial, a brief flash of anger, and, finally, strangely, a kind of weary relief, as if he'd been carrying the burden of this secret for so long. He was almost glad the charade was over. He didn't even bother to reach for the phone. "I think you know, Eleanor," he said, his voice low, avoiding her eyes. "Tell me anyway," she insisted, her composure a remarkable feat given the storm raging within her. He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, suddenly looking deflated, older. "It's Clarissa," he admitted, sinking into the chair opposite her. "My assistant." He paused, then added, as if it were some unavoidable act of nature. It just happened. Eleanor, I didn't plan it." A bitter laugh escaped Eleanor's lips. "Things like this don't just happen. Arthur," she countered, her voice gaining a steely edge, "you make choices, Day after day, you make 1,000 small choices that lead to this. This was a decision, a series of decisions. Suddenly, his own voice rose, laced with a self-pity that Eleanor found utterly contemptible. "You have no idea what this has been like for me," he exclaimed, gesturing vaguely around the room, as if the modified house, her wheelchair, were all an elaborate inconvenience designed solely to make his life difficult. "Everything changed, Eleanor. Our whole life, our plans, our future, all of it gone in an instant because of your accident." The cruelty of his words, the casual dismissal of her trauma, hit her with renewed force. "You think I don't know that?" she shot back, her voice now trembling with a tightly controlled fury. "You think I wanted this to lose my mobility, my independence, to have my entire world shrink to the confines of these rooms?" She took a deep, steadying breath. "The difference, Arthur, the fundamental difference between us in this is that I didn't have a choice in what happened to me. You did. You chose to betray me. You chose her." The conversation that followed was brutal in its unvarnished honesty. Arthur admitted the affair with Clarissa had been going on for months, even before she'd fully settled back home from rehabilitation. He talked about feeling trapped, about the unexpected stress of becoming a primary caregiver when he'd envisioned himself as an equal partner to a vibrant, successful woman. He spoke of Clarissa's youth, her energy, the way she made him feel alive and unburdened. Each word was another shard of glass piercing Eleanor's already wounded spirit. "And how do I make you feel, Arthur?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, the fight momentarily draining out of her. He couldn't meet her eyes then. He looked down at his hands, a long silence stretching between them, before he finally mumbled, "Guilty. You make me feel guilty, Eleanor." And in that pathetic admission, Eleanor saw the hollow core of the man she had once loved, the man who had chosen escape over loyalty, fleeting pleasure over enduring commitment. When the person you trusted most becomes the architect of your deepest pain, where does one even begin to find the strength to rebuild from such ruins? For Eleanor, the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. But one thing was crystal clear: the life she had known was over, and the man she had married was a stranger. In the ruins of what was, after the demolition crew of Betrayal has done its devastating work, sometimes the blueprint for what will be begins to emerge, almost invisibly at first, drawn not with ink, but with lines of quiet, steely determination. 2 weeks after that brutal confrontation, Arthur Morgan moved out of the home he had once shared with Eleanor. The divorce proceedings began with a swiftness that spoke volumes about his eagerness to shed his past and embrace his new, unburdened future with Clarissa, Eleanor's lawyer, a seasoned professional accustomed to high-asset divorces, assured her that given the circumstances, Arthur's blatant infidelity, Eleanor's significant disability directly impacting her earning potential, and the length of their marriage, she would be well provided for financially. "He wants to be generous, Eleanor," the lawyer had said, reviewing Arthur's initial settlement offer. "The offer is quite fair." Eleanor had offered a small, mirthless smile. "No," she corrected gently, "he wants to be free, Ms. Albright, and he's willing to pay dearly for it." There were no children to consider, their earlier discussions about family now a poignant lost dream. And Eleanor, frankly, didn't have the emotional or physical energy to fight over material possessions that suddenly felt hollow, tainted by the ghost of their shared life. She kept the house that was now both her sanctuary and a constant reminder of her changed circumstances. She received a substantial financial settlement, enough to ensure her comfort and continued care. And, most importantly, through it all, she retained her dignity, a quiet, unyielding core of self-respect that Arthur's actions couldn't touch. What surprised her most during this tumultuous period was her own unexpected calm. She had anticipated devastation, a complete emotional collapse under the dual blows of her profound physical disability and Arthur's callous marital betrayal. She expected to be consumed by grief, by rage, by a sense of utter desolation. Instead, she felt a curious, almost unnerving detachment, as if she were observing her life from a slight distance, a character in one of her own meticulously plotted novels. It wasn't that she didn't feel pain. She did, acutely. It was a deep, aching sorrow that settled in her bones, a constant companion in the quiet hours. But alongside the pain, coexisting with it, was something else: a writer's analytical curiosity, an almost professional interest in how this particular, very personal story would unfold. What would this character, Eleanor Vance, do next? How would she navigate this unforeseen, tragic plot twist? The final divorce papers were delivered for her signature on a crisp, sunny spring morning, the kind of day that usually promises new beginnings. As Eleanor meticulously signed her name, officially, irrevocably ending her marriage to Arthur Morgan, Helen Baxter, her ever-present, ever-kind caregiver, brought her a cup of soothing herbal tea and a thick, creamy envelope. "This came for you by special delivery, Eleanor," Helen said, her brow furrowed slightly with concern as she handed it over. Inside, embossed on heavy, expensive cream paper, were the names Arthur Morgan and Clarissa Dubois. Below them, a date, just one short week after their divorce would be finalized, and the venue, the Grand Oak Ballroom, one of the city's most exclusive and lavish locations for weddings. Eleanor looked up from the ostentatious invitation into Helen's watchful, compassionate eyes. "He's getting married, Helen," Eleanor said, her voice remarkably steady, betraying none of the complex emotions swirling beneath the surface. "Next Saturday." Helen took the invitation, her eyes scanning the elegant script, and a small sound of disgust escaped her lips. "The ink isn't even dry on your divorce papers. Eleanor, this is just cruel. It's beyond tasteless." Eleanor shook her head slowly, a thoughtful expression settling on her face. "No, Helen," she mused, her writer's mind already dissecting the motive. "This isn't primarily meant to be cruel. This is revealing." She paused, then met Helen's gaze. "He wants me to know. He wants me to see how quickly he's moving on, how deliriously happy he is, how utterly perfect and unencumbered his new life with Clarissa will be. It's a statement." "Are you all right, dear?" Helen asked gently, her concern palpable. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the raised, embossed letters of Clarissa's name. Then, a decision, surprising perhaps even to herself, solidified. "I'm going to go, Helen," she announced quietly but firmly. "To the wedding." Helen looked aghast. "But why on earth would you put yourself through that kind of torture? What possible reason could you have?" Eleanor smiled then, a small, private, almost enigmatic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the very same smile that would later puzzle the wedding guests. "Because, Helen," she said softly, her gaze distant, already looking towards some unseen horizon, "I've always believed that a good writer, a truly dedicated storyteller, needs to see the end of the story, all the way to the very last page." And in that moment, it was clear that Eleanor Vance wasn't just a discarded wife. She was an author considering her next, most compelling narrative. Sometimes, a casual observation from a trusted friend, a flicker of unease in their eyes, can be the unexpected key that unlocks a hidden, much darker room in a story you thought you already understood. Days before Arthur and Clarissa's ostentatious wedding, as Eleanor was steeling herself for the ordeal, she found herself in a quiet conversation with Helen Baxter. They were in Eleanor's sunroom, a space now filled with adaptive equipment, but also with the stubborn cheer of potted plants Helen diligently tended. Eleanor was discussing her rather unconventional decision to attend the wedding, explaining her writer's need to witness the culmination of this particular chapter in Arthur's life, and by extension, her own. Helen listened patiently, her hands methodically folding a freshly laundered blanket. She had been an unwavering source of practical support and quiet empathy since Eleanor's return home. As Eleanor spoke, Helen's usual calm expression wavered slightly. A shadow of something, hesitation, perhaps, or a deeper disquiet, flickered across her face. "You're making good progress with your upper body strength, Eleanor," Helen had said earlier, trying to maintain a professional demeanor, but now her gaze drifted towards the window. "Your determination is truly remarkable. I don't have much choice, do I, Helen?" Eleanor had replied with a wry smile. It's just me now, steering this ship. Helen paused her folding. May I speak frankly, Eleanor? She asked, her voice softer than usual. Eleanor nodded. Please, after all you do for me, I think we're past formalities. I've worked with many people going through profound life changes, illness, injury, loss. Helen began, choosing her words carefully. And what I've noticed is that the ones who truly survive, the ones who find their way back to a meaningful life, aren't always the strongest physically. They're the ones who manage to find a purpose beyond their own suffering, something to hold on to. I know, Eleanor said, her voice reflective. I need to start writing again. Seriously writing, before the accident, that was my purpose, my identity. Then that's where you'll find your strength, Helen affirmed. She hesitated again. Then, may I ask you something rather personal about this wedding invitation? Eleanor gestured for her to continue. Why are you really going, Eleanor? Most people in your situation would find it unbearably painful, a cruel reminder. Eleanor looked out at the garden, her gaze distant. I need to see it, Helen, to make it real, to properly close that chapter. As I said, and the woman he's marrying. I need to see her too, in that context. Clarissa Dubois. Helen's voice was carefully neutral, but again, that fleeting shadow crossed her features, more pronounced this time. Yes, Clarissa, Eleanor confirmed, turning back to face her. Something about her. I need to observe her. What is it, Helen? Eleanor asked, her novelist's instinct for human nuance immediately on alert. That flicker of unease hadn't escaped her notice. You seem troubled by the mention of her name. Helen busied herself unnecessarily with the blanket, avoiding Eleanor's direct gaze. Oh, it's nothing, really. I hope the day gives you the closure you're seeking, Eleanor. But Eleanor had caught that moment of hesitation, that almost imperceptible tightening around Helen's mouth. Helen, she said quietly, her voice gentle but firm, is there something about Clarissa Dubois that you're not telling me? Something you know? Helen sighed, a long, weary sound, and finally set the blanket down. She sat in the chair opposite Eleanor. I wasn't sure at first, Eleanor, and truly, it's not my place to interfere in your personal matters, especially with Mr. Morgan. What weren't you sure about? Eleanor pressed, leaning forward slightly in her wheelchair, her curiosity now fully engaged. When I first met Miss Dubois, Helen began slowly, her gaze now fixed on Eleanor's. When she came here to the house with Mr. Morgan once or twice before you finalized things, she looked familiar to me. Terribly familiar. I couldn't quite place it at first. It was like an old photograph just out of focus in my mind. Eleanor waited, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. And now you can, Helen nodded slowly. Yes, before I started working for the home health care agency that assigned me to you, I worked for several years at Willow Glen Senior Residence. It's a private nursing facility up in Connecticut. We cared for elderly patients, many of them quite wealthy, needing various levels of assistance. Her voice dropped a little. There was a woman there, a Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle. She was sharp as a tack mentally, but physically frail. She had a companion, a young woman who helped manage her affairs, who became almost like a granddaughter to her, so charming, so attentive. And this companion, Eleanor prompted. This companion, Helen said, her voice now laced with a grim certainty, looked exactly like Clarissa Dubois. Not just looked like her, Eleanor, it was her. Though back then, Helen added, delivering the crucial detail, she called herself Candace. Candace Marshall. A sudden chill snaked down Eleanor's spine. Her novelist's mind, always attuned to patterns, to the hidden architecture of deception, began to race, possibilities and dark connections forming with an alarming speed. Tell me about this Candace Marshall, Helen, Eleanor urged. Tell me everything you remember about her and her relationship with Mrs. Periwinkle. Helen recounted how Candace had systematically charmed her way into Mrs. Periwinkle's life and confidence. Mrs. Periwinkle had no close family, and she grew to depend on Candace for everything: companionship, managing her correspondence, even handling her financial accounts. Over time, Candace had gained power of attorney, isolated Mrs. Periwinkle from the few distant relatives and old friends she still had. And then, Helen's face hardened, her kind eyes now glinting with remembered indignation. Mrs. Periwinkle abruptly changed her will, leaving her entire substantial estate, millions by some accounts, to Candace Marshall. And what happened to Mrs. Periwinkle? Eleanor asked, a sense of dread coiling in her stomach. Within a month of changing that will, Helen said, her voice low and grave, Mrs. Periwinkle died unexpectedly. The doctors officially called it natural causes. She was 87, after all. But some of us on the staff, those of us who had seen Candace's methods up close, we had our doubts, serious doubts. And Candace Clarissa, she inherited everything, Helen confirmed. And then, almost immediately, Candace Marshall disappeared, vanished without a trace. A few months later, after some inconsistencies came to light regarding Mrs. Periwinkle's medication dosages and some unusual financial transactions just before her death, there was a quiet, internal investigation at Willow Glen, and I believe the family's lawyer looked into it. But by then, Candace Marshall was long gone. There were never any formal charges, as far as I know. It was just deeply suspicious. Helen looked directly at Eleanor, her gaze unwavering. Until I saw her here, in your home, calling herself Clarissa Dubois. And Eleanor, I recognized a tiny, very distinctive scar on her right wrist from where she once burned herself on a teapot at Willow Glen. It's her. I am absolutely certain. How many masks, Eleanor thought with a sudden, cold clarity, can one person wear before their true face is lost even to themselves? The wedding was no longer just an ending. It was, perhaps, the beginning of a very different kind of story. When the world attempts to silence your voice, when circumstances try to strip away your agency, sometimes the most powerful act of reclamation is to write a story that doesn't just whisper the truth, but screams it from the rooftops, albeit cloaked in the elegant disguise of fiction. Armed with Helen Baxter's chilling and meticulously detailed revelations about Candace Marshall and the unfortunate Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle at Willow Glen Senior Residence, Eleanor Vance felt a profound shift within her. The writer, the observer, the analyst of human nature, was now fully awakened, not by the desire for simple revenge, but by a burning, almost academic, imperative to understand and expose a predator. Her first step was to ask Helen, whose discretion she trusted implicitly, to discreetly reach out to any former colleagues from Willow Glen, anyone who might remember Candace or Mrs. Periwinkle, anyone who might have access to old records, however informal, or even just vivid recollections. Helen, deeply troubled by what she had witnessed and the potential danger Clarissa now posed to Arthur, however undeserving he might seem, readily agreed. Within days, trickles of information began to arrive. Another nurse recalled Candace's almost unsettling ability to charm, her knack for isolating her chosen patients. The facility administrator, long retired but still haunted by the Periwinkle affair, spoke of his deep regret, his feeling that they had somehow failed to protect Agnes. He remembered Candace's shifting background stories, her vague references to a privileged upbringing that never quite rang true. Then, through an online forum for retired healthcare professionals that Helen frequented, a new thread emerged. Someone mentioned a similar case a few years prior in Florida, involving a wealthy, recently widowed elderly gentleman, a Mr. Walter Hemlock, and a charming young female caretaker who had called herself Catherine Mayfield. This Catherine had, with alarming speed, gained Mr. Hemlock's complete trust, overseen changes to his will, and then, shortly after his sudden, though not entirely unexpected, death, had vanished with a considerable portion of his estate before his bewildered children could even begin to ask serious questions. The methods were eerily similar, the pattern of exploitation almost identical. The timeline also fit. The Florida incident predated the Connecticut one. "It's her, Eleanor," "Isn't it?" Helen had said, her voice heavy with conviction as they pieced together these fragments. Different name, different state, but the same predatory dance. Eleanor nodded slowly, a cold resolve settling within her. "Yes, Helen, it's Clarissa, or Candace, or Catherine. She's following her pattern. And now," she added, her gaze hardening, "she's Clarissa Dubois, about to marry Arthur, a wealthy man still reeling from a traumatic life change, my accident, our divorce. He's vulnerable. He's exactly her type." "Are you going to warn him?" Helen asked, the practical question hanging in the air. Eleanor considered this for a long moment. "And would he believe me? Helen," she mused aloud. "Or would he see it as the bitter, jealous ramblings of a discarded, disabled ex-wife? Clarissa has already woven her spell around him. He sees her as his rescuer, his fresh start. No." Eleanor decided, her path becoming clearer. A direct warning would likely be dismissed, perhaps even used by Clarissa to further isolate him from me, painting me as vindictive. Instead, Eleanor turned to her true weapon, her most trusted ally, her words, her craft. "I'm going to write a book, Helen," she announced, a new energy thrumming in her voice, a spark igniting in her eyes that Helen hadn't seen since before the accident. "A novel, a psychological thriller about a charming, utterly ruthless sociopath who preys on vulnerable, wealthy individuals. A woman who changes her identity as easily as she changes her designer clothes." And so, the Chameleon's Gambit began to take shape. Eleanor threw herself into the writing with a ferocity and focus that was all-consuming. Her protagonist, whom she named Valerie, was a masterpiece of calculated deception, beautiful, intelligent, and utterly devoid of empathy, yet capable of feigning deep emotion with terrifying skill. Eleanor meticulously wove in details gleaned from Helen's recollections of Candace Marshall and the shadowy Catherine Mayfield. She included Valerie's penchant for collecting antique perfume bottles, a detail Helen had recalled about Candace. She described Valerie's habit of twisting a lock of her hair when concentrating, a mannerism Eleanor herself had observed in Clarissa during her few visits to the house with Arthur. She even gave Valerie a fictitious history of having studied art in Paris, a claim Clarissa had made more than once. She didn't just focus on the mechanics of the con, she delved deep into the psychology of both the predator and her victims, exploring the dynamics of trust, loneliness, and the desperate human need for connection that such manipulators so expertly exploit. The character of Valerie was not a caricature of evil, but a chillingly realistic portrait of a sociopath, complex and compelling. And the character of Valerie's latest target bore an undeniable, though carefully fictionalized, resemblance to Arthur Morgan, a successful but emotionally naive man recently separated from his long-term wife after she suffered a debilitating injury. As she wrote, Eleanor felt a strange sense of power, of agency returning. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was the orchestrator of a narrative, a teller of a truth so potent it had to be veiled in fiction to be safely revealed. She was crafting a story that, if it found its mark, would not just entertain, but expose. It was a dangerous game, she knew, but it was the only one she felt equipped to play. The manuscript grew, chapter by painstaking chapter, each word a carefully placed stone in the path that would, she hoped, lead to Clarissa Dubois' unmasking. And so, we returned to that opulent ballroom, the Grand Oak, where the air hummed with forced gaiety and the scent of expensive flowers, where a knowing smile held the weight of secrets yet to be unleashed, a silent overture to a drama few could even imagine. The day of Arthur and Clarissa's wedding arrived, as all days do, regardless of the emotional freight they carry. Eleanor Vance, dressed with understated elegance, her composure a remarkable shield, navigated her way through the arriving guests. Helen Baxter, a quiet, supportive presence by her side. She wasn't there as a heartbroken ex-wife seeking to disrupt the proceedings, nor was she there to wallow in self-pity. No, Eleanor attended that lavish ceremony with the keen, dispassionate focus of a novelist conducting crucial field research, a meticulous observer gathering the final, vital details for her characters. She watched Clarissa Dubois, radiant in a designer gown that emphasized her youth and slender figure, play the role of the adoring bride with flawless precision. The way Clarissa gazed up at Arthur, her eyes shining with a carefully practiced innocence, the charming, deferential interactions with the few of Arthur's older business associates who were present, the subtle, yet unmistakable air of triumph she exuded. Eleanor cataloged it all. She noted how Clarissa had already, with an almost surgical skill, begun to isolate Arthur from his old social circle. Most of the guests, Eleanor observed, were Clarissa's friends, or newer business contacts Arthur had made since Clarissa's ascent in his life. His family members looked on with expressions that ranged from polite confusion to outright discomfort. Arthur himself seemed almost dazed, caught in the high beams of Clarissa's beauty and apparent devotion. He beamed with pride, yes, but also with something that looked disconcertingly like relief, as if he had successfully navigated a difficult passage and was now safely in a more pleasing harbor, oblivious to the fact that his new navigator was steering him towards treacherous reefs. Eleanor felt a pang, not of jealousy, but of a strange, almost maternal pity for his gullibility, his desperate need to believe in this perfectly packaged illusion. As the ceremony unfolded, with its soaring music and heartfelt, if somewhat generic, vows, Eleanor's mind was not on what she had lost, but on what she was creating. In her mind's eye, she was already outlining chapters of The Chameleon's Gambit, placing Valerie, her fictional con artist, in scenes that mirrored this very wedding. She imagined Valerie's internal monologue, the cold calculations behind her warm smiles, the predatory assessment of her new husband's assets and vulnerabilities, the lavishness of the event, the no-expense-spared decorations, the sheer theatricality of it all provided rich material. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a performance, and Clarissa was giving a command showing Eleanor's smile, the one that had so intrigued the few guests who dared to look her way, was indeed knowing. It was the smile of an author who sees the dramatic irony playing out before her very eyes, who understands the hidden motivations and the inevitable trajectory of her characters. It held a touch of grim understanding for Arthur's blindness, a chilling premonition for Clarissa's future exposure, and perhaps a quiet acknowledgement of her own, unexpected role in the unfolding drama. She was no longer just a victim of their actions. She was becoming the chronicler of their consequences. What a dangerous thing it is, one might reflect, to underestimate the quiet observer in the room, the one who sits silently, watching, listening, and perhaps taking meticulous notes for the story yet to be told. Isn't it? When the vows were exchanged and the new Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Morgan shared their first, carefully choreographed kiss as husband and wife, Eleanor felt no sting of regret. Instead, she felt a sense of completion. She had seen what she needed to see. She understood her characters now, all of them, the predator, the prey, and even herself, the reluctant narrator thrust into the heart of the tale. As the guests began to move towards the reception area, Eleanor quietly signaled to Helen. Her work there was done. She had gathered her material. It was time to go home and write the ending, not just to this chapter of her life, but to the carefully constructed illusion Clarissa Dubois had worked so hard to create. The knowing smile lingered, a silent promise of the reckoning to come, a reckoning that would be delivered not with tears or tantrums, but with the devastating precision of a perfectly crafted story. Words, once printed, bound between covers, take on a remarkable life of their own. They travel through the world, independent of their creator, whispering truths, sparking conversations, and sometimes igniting unforeseen fires in unexpected places. Eleanor Vance's novel, The Chameleon's Gambit, published by the esteemed Keystone Publishing House, did precisely that. From the moment it hit the shelves, it was clear this was more than just another psychological thriller. It was a literary event. Critics lauded its sharp prose, its intricate plotting, and above all, its chillingly authentic portrayal of a female sociopath. Ms. Albright, Eleanor's perceptive editor, had been ecstatic from the first read. "This is your best writing yet, Eleanor," she'd declared, her voice buzzing with excitement during one of their video calls. There's an authenticity to it, a razor-sharp insight. Your accident, as terrible as it was, hasn't diminished your talent. If anything, Ms. Albright had mused, it seems to have given your work a new, profound depth. Eleanor had simply replied, pain can be clarifying. Elaine, it has a way of stripping away all pretense. My Keystone Publishing House, sensing a bestseller, launched a significant marketing campaign. Billboards featuring the evocative cover of The Chameleon's Gambit, a woman's silhouette casting multiple, distinctly different shadows, began appearing in major cities. Beneath the title, a chilling tagline, she becomes whoever you need her to be until she takes everything you have. The campaign positioned the novel as Eleanor Vance's triumphant return to literature after her life-altering accident, highlighting her resilience and unwavering creative spirit. In the carefully orchestrated interviews that followed, Eleanor was a picture of grace and thoughtful articulation. Speaking on popular literary podcasts like Between the Lines, she talked candidly about finding strength through storytelling during her recovery. Writing this book saved me, in many ways, she confessed to one interviewer. When so much else was taken from me, my mobility, my marriage as I knew it, I still had my imagination, my ability to create worlds and characters, to make sense of chaos through narrative. When pressed, as she inevitably was, if the novel's potent themes of betrayal and deception reflected her personal experiences, particularly her recent divorce from Arthur Morgan and his swift remarriage to Clarissa Dubois, Eleanor was careful, almost sphinx-like in her responses. Writers draw from life, certainly, she'd concede with a gentle smile. We observe, we absorb, we synthesize. But The Chameleon's Gambit isn't an autobiography. It's an exploration of deception as both a dark art and a devastating weapon. The early reviews were enthusiastic, praising the novel's meticulous crafting and its unnerving authenticity. Sales soared, driven by critical acclaim and fervent word of mouth. Readers found themselves unable to put the book down, then eagerly discussed its unsettling protagonist, Valerie, with friends and online book clubs. One aspect that generated particular buzz was the vivid, almost unsettling realism of Valerie. As one popular booktuber put it in her widely viewed review, Valerie feels so terrifyingly authentic that you find yourself wondering if she's based on someone real. There are moments when the specificity of her methods, her little tells, is almost uncanny. Like Eleanor Vance has met this woman, studied her, knows exactly how her mind works from the inside out. This was precisely the reaction Eleanor had hoped for, yet it also filled her with a certain trepidation. Phase 1 of her plan, if it could be called that, was unfolding perfectly. The book was being recognized for its literary merit, its psychological depth, and its almost documentary-like realism regarding the mechanics of a certain type of con artist. Now, it was time for Phase 2, a more subtle fanning of the flames. Under a carefully chosen pseudonym, Observer 88, Eleanor created accounts on several influential literary discussioning forums and social media platforms where The Chameleon's Gambit was being hotly debated. Using these aliases, she began asking subtle, leading questions, disguised as genuine reader curiosity. Does anyone else feel like they've met someone like Valerie in real life? She'd post. Or, the details about Valerie's con in Connecticut, particularly the descriptions of the nursing home and the victim, seemed so specific. I wonder if it was inspired by a real, perhaps lesser-known, case. These carefully planted seeds of speculation took root with astonishing speed. Online book clubs began compiling lists of Valerie's distinctive traits and habits, her supposed art history background from Paris, her collection of vintage teacups, her aversion to shellfish despite claiming a coastal upbringing, the peculiar way she twisted her hair when deep in thought. Amateur sleuths, invigorated by the puzzle, started searching news archives and cold case files for stories of elderly individuals defrauded by manipulative caretakers or companions, looking for matches. On one popular Reddit thread dedicated to unsolved mysteries, a user claiming to have once worked at a Florida retirement community recounted a hazy memory of a similar case years ago. The woman called herself Christina something or other. She utterly charmed this wealthy widower, got him to change his will, and then vanished right after his death. The timeline would fit what could have happened before Valerie's Connecticut con in the book. Eleanor didn't need to fan these flames much further. The internet's collective curiosity, its insatiable appetite for piecing together disparate clues, did most of the work. Readers became informal investigators, collaboratively constructing a hypothetical real-life timeline for a Valerie-like predator who might have operated in Florida, then Connecticut, and might now, they speculated, be somewhere else entirely, perhaps under a new name, with a new target. The story was no longer just between the covers of a book. It was alive, breathing, and beginning to cast its own very real shadows. When enough sparks fly, diligently fanned by both literary artistry and the relentless curiosity of the crowd, even the most carefully constructed fire-proofed facade will eventually ignite, collapsing into a heap of damning revelations. What Eleanor hadn't fully anticipated, though perhaps her subconscious novelist mind had, was how quickly the online speculation would move from general theories about a Valerie-like con artist to specific, pointed questions about her own life. 6 weeks after The Chameleon's Gambit was released, a post appeared on a popular thriller fan forum that directly connected several dots with uncomfortable precision. The poster, Truth Seeker 22, wrote, "Okay, am I the only one who finds this too coincidental? Eleanor Vance's ex-husband, Arthur Morgan, remarries incredibly quickly after their very public divorce. His new wife, Clarissa Dubois, apparently appeared in his life right around the time of Vance's tragic accident. In the book, the con artist Valerie specifically targets a man whose life has been severely disrupted by his wife's sudden disability. The parallels are striking. Is this art imitating life, or something more deliberate? This post was initially removed by the forum moderators for speculating too directly about the author's personal life, a common rule on such platforms. But the idea, once unleashed, had taken on a life of its own. It resurfaced on Twitter, then on Facebook groups dedicated to true crime and mystery novels, and in the comments sections of numerous glowing book reviews. Eleanor watched this development with a complex mixture of emotions. She had wanted the truth about Clarissa's pattern of deception to emerge, but she hadn't quite expected the spotlight to swing so directly and intensely onto her own personal circumstances and possible motivations for writing the book. Her intent had been to illuminate Clarissa's character, not to become the center of a different kind of speculative story. The speculation gained significant momentum when a popular true crime podcast, Hidden Agendas, devoted an entire episode to meticulously analyzing the uncanny similarities between The Chameleon's Gambit and Eleanor Vance's real-life situation. The hosts were careful, stopping just short of making outright accusations. They framed their discussion as an exploration of how authors transform personal trauma and experience into compelling fiction. Oh, but they methodically, almost clinically, listed the parallels, the timing of Eleanor's accident, her subsequent divorce from Arthur Morgan, his swift remarriage to Clarissa Dubois, and the chillingly accurate portrayal of a manipulative predator in her novel that seemed to fit Clarissa's profile a little too snugly for mere coincidence. One morning, Eleanor received an urgent call from Ms. Albright, her editor at Keystone Publishing House. "Eleanor, have you seen the latest?" Ms. Albright asked, her voice tight with concern, dispensing with any preamble. "The Hidden Agendas podcast. Yes, I listened yesterday," Eleanor replied calmly. "No, not just the podcast, though that certainly fanned the flames," Ms. Albright said. "There's a rather pointed article in the National Review Monthly this morning. It's an opinion piece, examining the ethics of authors using fiction to potentially expose or attack real people. They don't name you specifically, Eleanor, but the reference is so blindingly clear, it might as well have your picture next to it." Eleanor sighed. "That was probably inevitable, I suppose, given the direction things were taking." "Eleanor," Ms. Albright said, her voice now careful, measured, "as your editor and also as your friend, I need to ask you directly. Is The Chameleon's Gambit, is it truly based on your ex-husband's new wife? Is Valerie a thinly veiled, almost literal, Portrait of Clarissa Dubois. There was a long pause before Eleanor answered, choosing her words with the precision of a diamond cutter. What I've written, Elaine, is a work of fiction. It is fiction informed by extensive research into the psychology of con artists, by observation of human nature, and by my understanding of how deception works. That is the truth. Ms. Albright was silent for a moment. That's not really an answer, Eleanor. It's the only one I can give right now, Eleanor replied softly. After they hung up, Eleanor wheeled herself to her study window, looking out at her garden, where the first tender signs of autumn were beginning to paint the leaves in hues of gold and crimson. The novel had been out for 2 intense months. The speculation was growing, becoming more focused, but it remained just that, speculation, however well informed. No one had yet managed to definitively connect Clarissa Dubois, the charming new Mrs. Arthur Morgan, to the shadowy figures of Candace Marshall of Connecticut or Catherine Mayfield of Florida in a way that was provable, public, and undeniable. For that to happen, Eleanor knew she needed someone with more than just readerly curiosity. She needed someone with investigative resources, someone who could follow faint paper trails, dig into sealed or forgotten records, and connect dots that were currently only visible to a very few. She needed, in short, a journalist. As if in direct answer to this unspoken thought, her phone rang again. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a different area code. Eleanor Vance speaking, she answered. Miss Vance, good morning. My name is James Sterling. I'm an investigative reporter with the Chronicle-Dispatch. His voice was calm, professional, with an undercurrent of serious intent. I was hoping I might be able to speak with you about your remarkable novel, The Chameleon's Gambit. Eleanor felt a flutter of anticipation, a sense that the next crucial piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. What aspect of the novel interests you, Mr. Sterling? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. The inspiration behind it, Miss Vance. Sterling replied, specifically, the character of Valerie and her, let's call them activities, in places that bear a striking resemblance to certain events in Connecticut and Florida. In researching some of the more specific scenarios you depicted in your book, I've stumbled across some rather interesting real-world parallels. Old cases involving elderly victims and a female perpetrator who seems to have a talent for changing identities. That certainly sounds like promising material for an investigative article. Mr. Sterling, Eleanor said, a faint smile playing on her lips. One has to wonder, did Clarissa, in all her cunning, ever imagine her carefully crafted world, her series of false identities, would begin to be dismantled not by a detective or a lawyer, but by a story, by the power of a narrative so compelling it forced hidden truths into the harsh glare of public scrutiny? It does indeed, Miss Vance. Sterling agreed, his tone matching her careful one. And given the timing of your novel and the extraordinary detail within it, I wondered if you might have some insights that could, perhaps, assist my investigation. Eleanor paused, considering her response. This was the moment. Mr. Sterling, she said finally, I believe it might be more productive if we were to meet in person. Would you perhaps be available to come to my home? Say, tomorrow afternoon. The game was truly afoot now, and the hunter, she sensed, was about to become the hunted, the fall of one queen in a meticulously constructed house of cards, especially when that house is built on a foundation of lies, often brings the entire deceptive structure tumbling down with breathtaking speed. James Sterling's explosive article in the Chronicle-Dispatch, The Three-Faced Fortune Hunter, How a Serial Con Artist Duped the Vulnerable, landed like a bombshell. It was comprehensive, damning, and meticulously documented, tracing Clarissa Dubois' predatory evolution from Catherine Mayfield in Florida with the unfortunate Mr. Walter Hemlock to Candace Marshall in Connecticut with the deceived Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle, and finally to her current incarnation as the glamorous new wife of Arthur Morgan. The article detailed her methods, the charming infiltration, the isolation of victims, the manipulation of finances and wills, and the uncanny timing of her victim's decline or demise. It included interviews with distraught family members of past victims, with former healthcare workers who had harbored suspicions for years, and with financial experts who explained the insidious mechanics of such exploitation. And, inevitably, it explored the undeniable, almost shocking, connections between these real-life crimes and Eleanor Vance's best-selling novel. The Chameleon's Gambit, quoting literary critics who now saw the book in a new, more disturbing light. The public reaction was instantaneous and intense. National news outlets picked up the story, and social media platforms buzzed with outrage and fascination. Readers of The Chameleon's Gambit expressed their shock at how closely fiction had mirrored a grim reality, many praising Eleanor's courage, while others debated the ethics of her approach. Book sales, predictably, spiked yet again as a new wave of readers, drawn by the real-life scandal, sought out the novel to see for themselves. As for Clarissa Dubois, the newly minted Mrs. Arthur Morgan, her carefully constructed world imploded spectacularly. True to the form Eleanor had so astutely captured in her fictional counterpart, Valerie, Clarissa vanished immediately after the article was published. It was a disappearing act that only screamed her guilt. She left behind a hastily packed suitcase at the opulent home she had so recently begun to share with Arthur and, more significantly, managed to withdraw a reported $50,000 in cash from their joint bank account before Arthur, reeling from the public humiliation and the devastating truth, could freeze her access. Arthur, utterly shell-shocked and deeply humiliated, retreated from public view. He issued a brief, terse statement through his high-powered attorney, Mr. Prescott, declaring himself yet another unfortunate victim of Clarissa Dubois' sophisticated deception and humbly requesting privacy during this trying time. Privately, he began the messy and undoubtedly expensive process of having their sham marriage annulled on the grounds of fraud. It was nearly a week later when Arthur finally contacted Eleanor. His name appearing on her caller ID was a jolt, the first direct contact in many months. She let it ring 3 times before answering, her voice calm, betraying none of the turmoil the past days had surely stirred. "Hello, Arthur," she said simply. His voice was tight, controlled, but with an undercurrent of barely suppressed rage and disbelief. "Is it true, Eleanor? All of it? Did you write that damn book, knowing who she was? Did you plan all of this?" Eleanor paused, choosing her words carefully. "Which part are you asking about, Arthur? Whether your new wife, Clarissa, is a serial con artist who has systematically preyed on vulnerable people for years, or whether I knew about her patterns when I wrote The Chameleon's Gambit. Both either. Just tell me the truth, for God's sake." "Eleanor," he almost shouted. "Yes, Arthur," she replied, her voice still even, measured, "to both questions." I learned about her past activities from Helen Baxter, who recognized her from her time in Connecticut. I researched further, as a novelist does, and I found the undeniable pattern, and yes, I wrote the book knowing exactly who and what she was. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, his voice laced with a bewildered anguish, he asked, "Then why, Eleanor, why didn't you just tell me? Why go through this elaborate public charade with a novel, and now this newspaper expose? You could have just warned me." Eleanor sighed softly. "Would you have believed me, Arthur, if I had called you up months ago and said, 'Arthur, your lovely, attentive Clarissa is a dangerous con artist who has a history of exploiting vulnerable people, very much like Mrs. Periwinkle and Mr. Hemlock?' What would you have done? You would have dismissed it as the jealous ramblings of a bitter ex-wife. You would have accused me of trying to sabotage your newfound happiness. Be honest with yourself." He had no immediate answer to that, because, deep down, he likely knew she was right. He had been so thoroughly enchanted by Clarissa, so desperate to believe in the illusion of his perfect new life, that any warning from Eleanor would have fallen on deaf ears. Instead of acknowledging this, Arthur, goaded by Mr. Prescott and his own wounded pride, made another disastrous decision. A few weeks later, Eleanor received a certified letter. It was a legal notice Arthur Morgan was filing a defamation lawsuit against her. seeking $10 million in damages. The suit, crafted by the notoriously aggressive Mr. Prescott, claimed that Eleanor had maliciously and knowingly published false information in The Chameleon's Gambit, designing it to destroy his marriage and his professional reputation. It was a desperate, ill-conceived move. Eleanor, far from being intimidated, immediately contacted her publisher, who put her in touch with Ms. Chen, a highly respected First Amendment attorney renowned for her fierce defense of authors. This is actually good news, in a twisted way. Eleanor, Ms. Chen had said after reviewing the lawsuit, defamation requires falsehood. If what you wrote, or rather, what your fictional story is based on regarding Clarissa's patterns, is substantially true, and thanks to Mr. Sterling's excellent investigative work, we have independent verification of those connections, then truth is an absolute defense. Mr. Morgan's lawsuit, ironically, gives us a very public forum to present all of this evidence again. The lawsuit did indeed reignite media interest, but it was becoming increasingly clear that Arthur was on a losing wicket. The preliminary hearing was a disaster for him. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, openly questioned Mr. Prescott about the specifics of the alleged falsehoods, given the weight of journalistic evidence supporting the claims against Clarissa. It was a bruising encounter for Arthur. Not long after that humbling court appearance, Arthur requested a meeting with Eleanor, this time without lawyers. He came to her home, looking older, diminished. He offered a halting but seemingly sincere apology for the lawsuit, for his blindness, for everything. After that hearing, he admitted, I finally did something I should have done months ago. I really looked at the evidence James Sterling found, the patterns, the financial trails. It's overwhelming. You were right. He then asked the question that had clearly been haunting him. Why didn't you just show me what you discovered, Eleanor, before the book, before everything? Eleanor looked at him, a mixture of old sadness and new strength in her eyes. I think you know the answer to that. Arthur, you wouldn't have believed me. You were too invested in your narrative of Clarissa as your perfect escape. By the time Helen recognized her, you were already deeply committed. He nodded slowly, the fight gone out of him. I abandoned you when you needed me most, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was selfish. I saw what I thought was an easy path to happiness with Clarissa, and I took it without looking back. He looked up at her then. I am so sorry, Eleanor, for everything. I believe you are sorry now, Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice gentle but firm. But I've moved beyond needing your apology, or even regretting its absence for so long. There is no us anymore. There hasn't been since the day you decided I was a burden. I've built a new life, a different one than I planned, but it's mine. He left shortly after, a man broken by his own choices, finally understanding the depth of his folly. The dominoes had fallen, and for Eleanor, a quiet, if complicated, sense of justice had finally begun to settle. For in the end, every story, no matter how filled with shadows, no matter how many twists and turns lead it through valleys of despair, searches for its own kind of light, its own meaningful resolution. The aftermath of Arthur Morgan's withdrawn lawsuit and his humbled apology brought a quiet sense of closure to that particular painful chapter for Eleanor Vance. The media circus eventually moved on, though The Chameleon's Gambit and its real-life connections continued to be a touchstone in discussions about literary ethics and the power of narrative. Life, however, has a way of continuing its own story. Several months later, news arrived that Clarissa Dubois, or rather Celeste Montgomery, her birth name finally unearthed by relentless investigators, had been located. She was in Portland, Oregon, already attempting to establish herself under yet another alias, Claire Duval, an art consultant, and had, with her typical alacrity, insinuated herself into the circle of a wealthy, recently widowed philanthropist known for her impressive private art collection. But this time, her pattern was recognized. Someone in the widow's circle, an avid reader and member of a local book club that had recently discussed The Chameleon's Gambit, made the chilling connection after noticing Claire's uncanny resemblance to descriptions of Valerie and the circulating news stories about Clarissa. The authorities were contacted, and Clarissa's reign of deception was finally, definitively over. Extradition proceedings began, and she would eventually face a litany of charges in both Connecticut and Florida. For Eleanor, this news brought not a surge of vindictive triumph, but a quiet, profound satisfaction. The pattern was broken. The predator had been stopped. Her words, born from her own pain and resilience, had traveled further and achieved more than she could have ever anticipated. Her own life continued to reshape itself in unexpected and rewarding ways. The success of the Chameleon's Gambit had not only restored her literary reputation, but had also provided substantial financial security. She used a portion of the proceeds to establish the Vance Foundation, dedicated to supporting research into spinal cord injuries and, close to her heart, providing creative writing grants and opportunities for disabled individuals. The Streamflix adaptation of her novel was a critical success, bringing her story and the underlying themes of resilience and the fight for truth to an even wider audience. She worked closely as a consultant, ensuring that the portrayal of her character, and particularly her disability, was authentic and respectful, avoiding the usual tropes of tragedy or saintliness. Her new novel, tentatively titled Reconstruction, was progressing well. It was a deeply personal work, drawing from her own experiences of navigating the world from a wheelchair, of rebuilding a life from its foundations. But it was also a gripping psychological suspense story about the invisible strengths people discover within themselves when faced with the unimaginable. One evening, as early spring was beginning to breathe new life into her meticulously tended garden, Helen Baxter, who had remained a steadfast friend and companion, sent Eleanor a photo on her phone. It was a close-up of the first crocuses pushing their vibrant purple heads through the still, cool earth. The accompanying text simply read, "Life goes on, Eleanor, and beautifully." Eleanor smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. Yes, life did go on. Differently than planned, certainly, shaped by losses and obstacles she would never have chosen. But it was a life rich with new purpose, with a deeper understanding of herself and the world. She had lost a husband, but found an unshakable sense of self. She had lost mobility, but gained a profound perspective. She had faced betrayal and emerged not bitter, but wiser, more authentic, more fully and fiercely herself. Eleanor's extraordinary journey reminds us, doesn't it, that even when life writes a devastating, unwanted chapter, we still hold the pen, we still possess the power to draft the next one, to find meaning and strength in the most unexpected places. What hidden strengths, what untapped reserves of resilience might you discover when faced with your own unexpected turns? Perhaps Eleanor's story, her quiet determination, and the ultimate victory of her spirit offers a small beacon of hope. If her journey from profound loss to a reclaimed voice resonated with you, perhaps you'll find more stories of inner strength, quiet courage, and the enduring power of the human heart to heal and rebuild, right here.